The West has been weakening men since the Ottoman Empire by using education systems that were altered, cinema, feminism, but also secret operations. From Macron getting slapped on television to the first cinema opening up in the Ottoman Empire, it was all designed to weaken men. And today we're going to talk about how to fight back. In our previous episode, I talked about how during the Ottoman reign, the Jewish cults started by Sabbatai Seifi targeted women in the Ottoman Empire, and their goal was to eventually dethrone the Sultan. And they did that by implementing feminism and by making sure that marriages wouldn't be stable, that they would make women believe that they had to rebel against their husbands, and that God was partially a woman and that women should become prophets. And so one thing that really bothered me at the time is I couldn't understand how they were able to target women when in Islam we are actually told that men are our providers and protectors and maintainers. And so the question I had was, how did they even target women, or how did they even reach women when men are supposed to be between that? And then I realized something that I've been researching for a while, that it was all connected, because when this thing happened with Macron getting slapped, I actually started this little research about whether there is an agenda in the West where they're trying to promote the emasculation of men. And I'm going to tell you why I started it. When I watched the clip of Macron getting slapped, I was like, this doesn't look normal. To me, it seemed staged. Like, it didn't seem to me like he was surprised by the slap. It was almost like he was proud, like a baby. That's how I felt he looked. Like he got slapped and he looked like he was born yesterday, like a chicken who just came out of an egg. Like, that's literally what he looked like to me. And when I saw that, I was like, why would they do that? Like, why would they make this world leader seem so emasculated and just like so a bit dumb? You know, he looked a bit dumb. And I was like, this is not a coincidence. You're not going to tell me that, first of all, this happened with him without him being aware of this happening. Like, this man is a leader, a world leader. You know, tens of millions of French people are looking up to him as their leader. And even if it did happen, you're not going to tell me that he didn't have the power to pull something like that off the internet, off TV. So I felt like this was definitely planted there to make it, you know, seem normalized that a man is getting like abused by his wife and everybody sees it and it's a powerful man. And, you know, when I realized that, I was like, is this a thing? Like, is this a goal that these big institutions might have, that they're just doing this on purpose? And so I started researching, you know, how society possibly is trying to weaken men. And I started looking at all these different elements in a society that are really important, like education, academia, the workplaces, you know, leisure. How do we spend our time in our free time? And I found that actually all of these parts tend to be designed in a way that it weakens men. And so, you know, when I researched that, I was like, wow, this is really interesting. But I couldn't really understand why they would do that. So at the time I was like, okay, so they have this agenda of weakening men, but with what purpose? And then so last week, when I found out that they, you know, tried to end the Ottoman Empire by targeting women, I realized that could have only been possible if they had already weakened men. And so today I want to tell you about how they do it now. So I'm going to tell you about all these different elements in society, how they are designing it to make men feel. And I'm also going to show you how several of these elements were also present during the Ottoman Empire and designed in a way to weaken the empire and weaken the Muslim ruler and subsequently end the caliphate, you know, because like the last real caliph was Abdulhamid II, who also was dethroned by this sect I just mentioned, right? The sect that is pro-feminism. It's a Jewish sect, and they target women. They try to destabilize societies by targeting women. But obviously, there had already have to be a agenda in place to also weaken men. It cannot be different. Okay, so once I connected the dots, like things really started becoming more apparent to me that it's not just this thing with Macron that happened. Like I just started seeing it everywhere. I mean, one thing that I think I feel like everybody has this, right? Like on your feed on social media, you've seen Zelensky being dressed up like a woman, you know, and dancing and doing all these things that are a little bit perverted, making him seem super feminine, and this all while, you know, his country's going through a war. And like that really made me wonder, like, how do Ukrainians feel? Because like their leader is basically someone who got famous through dressing up like a woman, wearing high heels and dresses, and now all these Ukrainian men are being snatched up from the streets because they are being forced to fight in the war, and their leader is doing photo shoots in Vogue. Like, how does that make sense? Like, aren't people alarmed by these, you know, coincidences that are taking place? And then very recently, like the most recent event, I would say, where I felt like, come on, guys, this is just so obvious, was when the former prime minister of the Netherlands, who is currently the chief of NATO, which is basically the war department of the European Union. Like they decide, you know, how much money they're going to spend on war, who they're going to target, what they're going to steal. And he called Trump daddy. I don't know if you've seen it, but like obviously I'm Dutch, so for me it was really interesting to watch. It was not interesting, it was also very cringe. But he basically was doing a talk with Trump in front of a bunch of journalists, and then he was like, yeah, said something along the lines of, yeah, daddy had to get mad. Like, you know, it was weird. It was uncalled for. Like, I don't understand why they do these things. I don't know why they put these people in those places. Well, actually, I do know why. Because I think it's orchestrated to change the way we view men. And it's part of a larger agenda, not just putting these people in place so that we have these role models, supposedly like role models who behave like women, but also because they want us to change our idea of men. And this is just a small part of the puzzle. And then, I mean, once I started noticing, yeah, you really start noticing, right? And so another thing that I thought was like really noticeable is like, another thing that I realized lately is that there's a lot of these researches that come out where, you know, men are also very much disrespected, but it's not necessarily the research, it's more the way things are phrased. For example, I saw this research that said that women, they tend to sleep better next to a dog than anyone else. Okay, that was the research. They just sleep better next to a dog than anyone else. But then all of these social media outlets started saying women sleep better next to a dog than their husband or a man. And just like disrespecting men, I felt, you know, because that wasn't what the initial research was about. It was definitely also about men, but it was also about children. It was also about, like, I don't know, your sister. Like, it doesn't matter who they were sleeping next to. They just tend to sleep better next to a dog. And so these things are really starting to, you know, I don't know, it just becomes more noticeable once you realize it, that there's definitely the idea we're pushing that men are not worthy, I would say, but also that it's funny to emasculate men. I don't think it's funny, especially not anymore now that I realized all these things. But I guess there is this push towards laughing at men when they're being emasculated, and for people to, you know, push that agenda, promote the agenda, be part of the agenda. That's something that I do see once I started, you know, getting into it, once I started learning about all these different parts of society that are designed to make men feel. Okay, and so, you know, it's funny because I posted also a little bit of a trailer from my last episode saying, you know, I'm going to talk about how men are being emasculated and it's an agenda. And one of my followers, she sent me a message saying like, I was trying to find a t-shirt very recently and I went shopping. I was trying to find a t-shirt at Forever 21. And she said it was very hard to find something that wasn't tight or that wasn't a crop top, she said. And so she said, I started looking in the men's department. And then she said, when I was looking in the men's department, I found all these t-shirts that were more suitable for me, but they were also, many of them were like pink. They had like roses on them, purple, like very feminine. And she was like, I eventually bought one, but she was like, I was really surprised that there were so many options for men that were t-shirts that were actually pretty feminine. And so for the women's department, it was just too sexualized, but when it came to the men's department, it was very feminine, she mentioned. And when I saw the t-shirt she ended up buying, I was also like, what? But then again, it does suit this whole trend of men wearing women clothing, because like a lot of celebrities nowadays, men, they wear dresses or they wear skirts on red carpets. It's like, well, since when is that really popular? Because we did determine at some point that these are reserved for women. I mean, it's not like centuries ago when all men were wearing skirts, or it's not like in the Middle East where men wear like long robes. I mean, in Western countries, it's very well known that dresses and skirts are reserved for women. So it doesn't really make sense, but it does seem like there's this push towards making men look more feminine. Okay, so that's something that I started noticing, the great noticing. But then when I researched it, and this was like 6 weeks ago, I was in the Netherlands when I saw this thing happen with Macron when he was getting slapped. That's when I started researching it, because I was like, this is not normal. This seems staged. Okay, so at that time, I started looking at several parts of society. One is academia. And the reason why is because I actually researched this also a year ago, where I found out that elite universities like Princeton, Yale, and Stanford, like they have all these programs nowadays where they are trying to redefine masculinity. And I remember a year ago when I saw how Princeton was trying to redefine masculinity, I was just like laughing at it, because they're pushing this idea that men should be more feminine. They should disregard gender roles, and they should also adopt gender roles that were previously only reserved for women, and for a good reason. So they were saying, men shouldn't be the breadwinner in a household exclusively anymore. Men should also become more comfortable with nurturing roles. But also they said, men need to be able to show more weakness, not try to be tough, vulnerability. They need to not have anger or jealousy or lust. And I was like laughing at the time, because like the research in the West still shows that women, they do the most part of the household chores. They are the ones who are doing most of raising the children. So I feel like for these societies that then promote that men should not be breadwinners, I feel like it's a bit unfair, right? Because these women don't live in societies where men are doing, their part in the household either. So what are they supposed to do? Are they supposed to like birth children, raise them, but also at the same time be like a breadwinner and, be the ones to like take care of their family, protect their family, be the tough ones? I mean, I think that's a lot. And so I thought that was really weird. What's really interesting though is that Trump, he did put a stop to these diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. And that's the thing about Trump, I don't think he necessarily is down with this entire agenda for weakening men. I really do feel like that, because first of all, these programs were defunded. But second, when you look at how he treats people like Macron and Zelensky, but also Premier Rutte, of like the former minister Rutte, the former Dutch minister, Prime Minister Rutte, he kind of mocks them. And so he exposed Rutte, for example. He posted the text messages that Rutte sent him privately. He posted them online. That's one thing he did. Another thing, I think he made a joke about Macron getting slapped. And everybody knows when Zelensky came to the White House, like Trump completely destroyed him. I mean, that's one thing I'm gonna say about Trump. He really does not like the agenda, I feel, and good for him. I think it's healthy for a country to have a very, masculine role model, because nowadays kids, boys, they don't really have those role models in their environment anymore. They're really looking at the media to find these role models, and so for a president, it's actually really important for them to have a masculine, attitude, I think, because in the end, this is going to decide how they'll end up as well. I just wonder, like you're like French, you wake up, you're like turning on the TV and you're just watching your president get abused, like domestically abused, like spanked on television. That's not a good feeling. But the same goes for like Rutte. Like, I'm Dutch, like when I saw that, I can imagine Dutch people also trying to kind of like make it seem normal. Like, yes, it's just the ex-president Rutte. He said Trump was his daddy, and that's how they talk. And I think they don't really get that this is super abnormal behavior, because I do think that Dutch people tend to be very they tend to be a bit gullible, I would say. I think they're watching that news and thinking like it's completely normal. And also, Rutte himself was like defending it because a journalist asked him why he called him daddy. And he was literally like, I think he said something like, yeah, I just like him, and that's why I called him daddy or something. And then Trump was asked about it as well. And he also said, I think he really likes me. That's why he called me daddy. It's not okay. Anyways, I just want to tell you something about why it's not a negative thing to have gender roles, and why for men and women, these things are actually very healthy. And so there's this book I read a long time ago. It was by John Gray. And I don't know if you know John Gray, but he's from this best-selling book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And in this book, he describes how men and women process stress differently. And I've talked about this before, but he explains that women produce happy hormones when they nurture. So when they're stressed, it's actually really good for them to nurture. Like, they just have to follow their gender roles. I'm so sorry, but that's how their biology is wired. My biology is wired. And I think we need to not try to think that we're better than the way that God designed us. Like, it's the way it is. Like, you can pretend to be better, but in the end, you're just going to suffer because this is how you're wired. Okay, and another thing he talks about is how men are wired to solve problems. And so I feel like when these elite universities are saying, men should be more nurturing and let women be the breadwinner, I'm like, but if you don't feel happy doing that, then why should a man do that? Like, if a man is wired to protect his family, provide for his family, why do we then have to force them to step away from their gender roles and do something else? Like, why are you misleading people? Like, that's not gonna make them happier. Anyways, in Islam, we say very clearly that women and men, they have different responsibilities in life, and there's nothing embarrassing about that. Like, you just follow that and it's good for you, and that's it. I don't know. I don't think we need these type of researchers to prove that the Quran is right. At least I think I shouldn't need that, and I think others shouldn't either. But it turns out that this is also proven to be right. It's proven to be helpful for women to do that. Anyways, okay, that's number one. Then I want to talk about number two, another element of society which is designed for men to become weak is the way that we spend our free time and how men spend their free time. And so leisure designed to demotivate and distract. That's what we're going to talk about. And so to talk about this in depth, I actually read this book by Leonardo Sachs, and he is this physician, psychologist. I think he's also a professor in the US. He's a Christian man, and he has written Boys Adrift, which is about why men are nowadays very demotivated and distracted, and they're not doing well in school. They're also increasingly doing less well in workplaces. They're having more psychological issues. And he talks about how the way that men are being exposed to porn, but also video games, is basically ruining them. Because he talks about how when men watch, for example, naked women, they get like all these happy hormones that a man would typically get after doing, work. Like they would have to do something, achieve something, and then get a dopamine hit. And the same goes for video games. It gives them a sense of control, but actually they're not controlling anything. They're not achieving anything. And so he talks about how the way that men and boys are now excessively being exposed to naked women, like you cannot look anywhere without seeing a naked woman, is actually messing with them mentally. It's making them demotivated to go out there and achieve something, but it's also giving them the wrong idea about what a woman should look like. It's also making them less interested in pursuing real life relationships, and it's also therefore making them less emotionally developed because they're not having those relationships. And this is very harmful for a society where, men are not now pursuing women, and when they do, they don't know how to deal with them. And so this shows to me that the society we have as of now, like it's not designed to help men. Like I think there should have been controls in place to make sure men are not exposed to this, but unfortunately it's just becoming more and more the case that men are exposed to it. Okay, and then we have another part, which is education. The workplace and education are also right now designed to break the societal status of a man. And Professor Leonardo Sachs, he talks about how education nowadays is designed to make women excel and men or boys less interested, less engaged, and eventually drop out. That's what the current education system is like. I don't know if you know this, but the education system in the US was also funded since 1903 by Rockefellers. And so they started doing that. This was a model, and I'm going to explain how they also did it in the Ottoman Empire to make sure they could push certain agendas. And they openly talk about, like, this is well known, like you change education system to push a certain way of thinking. And this education system, okay, so it's less experimental, it's less competitive, and those are elements that boys need in order to pay attention. And so instead nowadays, it's very theoretical, which benefits girls but not boys. And so boys are increasingly having less attention for school. They're less interested. They're just like not at all engaged. And this is very harmful for how men and women develop, eventually how men and women will get, jobs, because if women become more highly educated, which they are right now, then they will also end up getting better jobs, which is also happening right now. And it will also lead to women earning more, which is also starting to happen right now. And so, again, this is not designed to make men thrive or boys thrive. It's making them weaker in society. And the results are already in countries like, for example, Suriname, South America, but also in the Netherlands. Girls are excelling more in university, or they're getting more degrees in university, but also husbands are becoming less often breadwinners. So right now in the US, for example, only 55% of marriages has a man who is the breadwinner. And in Europe, in countries like Luxembourg, women are now starting to earn more than men. And, women have been outperforming men in leadership skills since quite a few years. 2019, I found an article by Harvard that said women already outperform men in almost every critical leadership skill. And so the question is, why are we still pushing these women's empowerment programs if we can see this happening, right? I think at this point, we actually should be doing the opposite, because I think men are quickly going to lag behind. And you might think, okay, well, what's the problem with that? What if men are just not doing as well? What if they earn less? Is that a problem? Well, if you look at the way this impacts relationships, I would say it is a problem because women and men are both more dissatisfied in relationships where the woman earns more. This has been proven. And I mean, I could have expected that, right? It's also this idea that a man is a protector and provider. As a woman, you're a bit more vulnerable when you want to have kids, when you want to have a family. And it is definitely more risky as a woman. You risk your life having a child, so someone should be there to protect you. There's nothing wrong with saying that, but it almost feels criminal. And the thing is, if then you have a society that's designed for men to not be able to provide or protect, like that's a problem, right? If these relationships are not working out anymore because the society is designed for women to excel, that's a problem. Okay, and then finally, another thing that Leonardo Sachs talks about is how there's a lack of role models for men. And he also talks about this for women in another book, by the way. But men grow up, they're being introduced to society without having role models or older men who guide them in this transitional phase. That's what he talks about. And so I guess men are looking at social media, the media, maybe even political leaders to give them that role model. And then you have people like Macron and Zelensky and Rutte. Who are those role models? Like, that's not very helpful. And so that's a problem. And yeah, I guess this is why they're just not performing well. Another thing that he mentions is that the toxins in our foods are also making men more feminine and women more masculine. And I thought that was really funny because I believe there's also this I think there's only a handful of companies who produce all our food, right? And so for then our food to also follow again this trend that women are becoming more masculine and men are becoming more feminine, even through food. It's like, I don't think that's a coincidence. Okay, anyways, this is just how society is designed. And then you might wonder, but what is the impact on women? Another book that this same physician has written, but there's a lot of studies outside of that confirm what he found as well, because he talks mainly about the US, but I could find his findings for other countries as well, like I mentioned, in Europe or South America. And so he found that women lost the will to live. Okay, so Leonardo Sachs found that, women are being more sexualized than ever. They're expected to be more athletic than ever because obviously the beauty standards have changed also for women. They cannot just be a little bit chubby like they used to be. But then again, women are expected to excel in school because those are the trends we are already seeing. So this is something that people expect from women. At the same time, they're expected to excel in the workplace as well because women are being pushed now to take on all these leadership roles. And all of this together is leading to women being more depressed and anxious than ever. And this is something that can be measured not just in the US, this is in other places, other parts of the world as well. One thing that some people say is, but it's just become more normalized to talk about depression and anxiety. That's why you see that more women claim to be depressed and anxious. And like that definitely resonates with me, that sometimes a topic becomes more normalized to talk about, which is why you might find that these statistics rise over time. But something that completely debunks that is that the amount of women taking their own lives has also drastically increased. So you could say that if it was just about normalizing mental disorders, then talking about it would be very helpful, right? The fact that we can accept it and talk about it would mean that less women would take their lives because they can finally talk about it. But that's not the case. It's taking extreme forms, the depression, anxiety, to the point where women just take their own lives. They don't want to live anymore. That's crazy. Anyways, what I find very interesting is, like I said, he is a physician who is Christian, and I find his books very interesting. He has Girls on Edge and Boys Adrift. And he advises parents to make sure their daughters dress modestly because he is really against it. He says that it's just not benefiting them. It's not benefiting boys. Not a Muslim. And then on top of that, he also says that it's very important for girls to find purpose in life through spirituality. Again. And so this seems to be something that would help these women. And he has so many cases where he's seen that, but also he quotes a lot of research. I would advise any parent to read those two books. It's very important, I would say. But okay, anyways, I talked about this topic. I've said like they've been doing this since the time of the Ottoman Empire. And that's something that's really of interest to me because I started researching the downfall of the Ottoman Empire since last week, right? And well, not since last week, but I did an episode on it last week. And so I just want to share with you how this has also been taking place in the Ottoman Empire, how similar trends can be found during that time as well, popping up towards the end of the Ottoman Empire. And I'm going to share them with you. Okay, so first of all, I've told you about Sabbatai Seyfi, who infiltrated the Ottoman Empire, and he was a Jewish cult leader. He pretended to be Muslim so he could infiltrate the Ottoman Empire. He did that with this group of people. They now refer to these Jewish people who pretended to be Muslim as Dolmei. Not everybody in Judaism follows this sect, by the way. It's a sect, right? So it's a division within the religion. A lot of people believe it's not true even within Judaism. And this sect is based on Kabbalah, which is black magic in Judaism, by the way. So I think that's really important to know. And this was about 350 years ago that he started the sect, and that's also when he started infiltrating the society and forming groups within the Ottoman Empire, which ended up taking down the Sultan at the time, the last real caliph. They say there have been caliphs after, but they say he was the last one who had power. He was the last one who was very religious and who also advocated for a more religious empire. Okay, so what happened during the Ottoman Empire? During the rule of the last caliph against his wishes, well, there's mixed reviews about it, but I could see why he wouldn't want to have a cinema in the Ottoman Empire. But a cinema was open, so they started with the entertainment industry during his reign as well. And you might know the organization Pathé, because that's also the organization that started with the first cinema in the Ottoman Empire. And the first cinema operator, film director, and film producer was Zygmunt Weinberg, which was a Polish Jewish man. And Pathé right now is still alive, by the way, in the Netherlands. But this organization was opened in 1908, so 1908. And Zygmunt Weinberg was a businessman. He rented the amphitheater hall from the municipality of Istanbul and converted it into a cinema. Interesting. I think the history of Pathé is very interesting in general, I have to say, because at some point it was owned by this other gentleman named Bernard Nathan, and he was also a Jewish man, and he ended up being locked up because he produced the first dirty movie, you could say. And this guy, he is famous for having done that. You have to understand this was around 1929. And so Bernard Nathan was the first person to produce a dirty movie. He ended up being locked up, but I thought that was very interesting, and what can I say? I'm just noticing it. It was a Jewish man, and he was locked up at some point also for having made such a dirty movie. Okay, anyways, then there is the part of... So we've had Sabbatai Seyfi, the entertainment, then we have education. So another thing that started happening during the end of the rule of the last real caliph in 1908, and this has been researched by the Journal of Balkan and Near Eastern Studies, is that the CUP, and that was the political party which was made up of these pretending to be Muslim Jewish people, That's the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, you should know that. They were the ones who also started getting into education because they wanted to push the agenda. They believed in through education, and they believed they could achieve a social revolution if they would, educate the masses with their own ideas. They said it would be essential to create a national identity for the Ottoman Empire through education. So they had a say in that. And the US, they started doing this since 1903. I've told you about that. That was funded by the Rockefeller. So education, you can say, was compromised as well. And then in the end, there was a revolt against the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and this became, in the end, one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire ended. He was exiled, and that was eventually the end of the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate. And I think we should be taking that very seriously, because if the Ottoman Empire and the Caliphate were vulnerable to all these influences of outside who had the goal of spreading their own religion and breaking down Islam, what do you think is going to happen now? Like, the Ottoman Empire was super strong. They had a super strong Muslim identity. They were everywhere. They were everywhere in the world, being rulers, dominating the world, and still they were being infiltrated by another religion, this Jewish sect, and they weren't able to withstand. Like, how do you think we're gonna be able to defend ourselves now, or to defend our religion right now? I think it's gonna be very hard. And that's why I think we should be taking it way more seriously. And so I want to share some of the warnings which I think are really important and which can be really helpful for Muslims. Okay, for men who want to stay strong while this is all happening. Well, first of all, I think it's really important for Muslims and Muslim men specifically to take the warnings in the Quran seriously, because like I said last time, the warning that Allah has given us that we would be infiltrated was shared. It is in the Quran, and it is also written in the tafsirs that it's specifically about Jewish people who will infiltrate our religion and say they are Muslim when they're not Muslim. So this is not something that we would not be able to see coming, because we had a warning like that. And it happened. And, Allah also said that they will try to make us follow their religion. That's what they'll try. And so people might feel sometimes like, when these agendas are being pushed, it's just atheist people who want to spread their own ideas. But that's not what we've been warned about. We've been warned that we will have people around us who want us, Muslims, to follow their religion. So that's something that we need to take into account. And so I think what's also very important is that, instead of looking at all these role models who, sometimes are aggressive men online, or these like so-called psychologists online who do not know anything about Muslim values, I think it's important for Muslims to find Muslim role models who do have these values and who, are not at the same time pushing them to follow a religion that's not their religion, because in the end, that is something that we've been warned about. Anyways, there's several things that we see now that are making men weak. And I think these are the things that Muslim men should be very wary of. The first one being nudity. So Salahuddin, I don't know if you've heard this quote, but he said, if you want to destroy an empire, then you should make, without war, if you want to destroy any nation without war, make adultery or nudity common in the young generation. That was his warning. And this is something that we can find in the Quran as well. Men are instructed to lower their gaze. And if you read the tafsirs, it says, Allah will, whoever protects his gaze, Allah will illuminate his understanding or his heart. But also the zina of the eyes is looking. And zina obviously is a really big sin in Islam. But also lower your gaze, since looking provokes their heart to evil. So there's many different warnings which tell you that looking at nudity is bad for your heart, it's bad for your religion, and it also will lead to evil. And so when men think, or women think that we're not supposed to look at the opposite gender because we sexualize each other, it's much deeper than that. It has very little to do with the person itself. It has more to do with your own psyche. And I mean, nowadays, science can prove it, that when men are exposed to naked bodies, for example, and they're married, they're less happy in their marriages. Like, that's literally what science can prove. It can prove that men are less motivated in life when they're exposed to a lot of nudity. But like, the Quran already warned us about this like more than 1,000 years ago. So this is something that we should have been taking seriously without all these researches anyways. But it does mean lowering your gaze. As a man, it means making sure you protect your heart, your religion, yourself, by simply not looking at places where there's going to be a lot of nakedness. Like, that's all I can say. That means you probably shouldn't watch TV. But okay, maybe that's a little bit maybe that's a little bit too much for us. But I think for women, I also think this is really important, because a lot of women, they will talk about how they really want to have a strong man in their life. They want that. But then at the same time, they don't feel the need to behave in a way that men in our societies can be strong, which is very, I would say, selfish. And Islam, I would say, is a religion of the collective, right? You do things not just because it benefits you, but it benefits you not to harm others. And when something is harmful to others, you are advised not to do that in Islam. It's a very collective religion. And so if you want to have a strong man, I don't think we should have this goddess complex where we say, oh, but I'm allowed to do whatever I want. And if a man is going to have issues because of that, that's his problem. That's like the idea that we have in the West, which I would say it really comes from this Jewish cult where women are made to believe they're goddesses. Like, you're not a goddess. If you do something wrong, you are not elevated or, so divine that you will not be touched by that or harmed by that. We don't believe that in Islam. But for men, it means lower your gaze. For women, it means behave in a way that, you are also not harming others. That's what I would say. And the second thing I think is really important for men to do is they need to man up, I would say. And the reason why is in the Quran, we also have a warning that says that in the end, we will be seduced by shaitan to change our creation, to change the creation of Allah. And what is meant by that is also, apart from like all the plastic surgery, it's also obviously the transgenderism. It's also about, you're born as a man to be with a woman, but you decide, okay, I'm going to be with a man. Like, those type of things, those are parts of these warnings that we receive. And in the West, for a long time, they used to say you're born gay, but nowadays they don't say that anymore. They say openly, actually, this is something that's affected, it is influenced by the environment. The largest part of being gay is being impacted by your environment. And so for women and men to adhere to their gender roles is actually something that science can prove nowadays. It will lead to you being gay or not gay. And that's the reason why in Islam, obviously, this is advice, like, behave like your gender, don't behave like the opposite sex. And yeah, I mean, even if you're the type of person who's like, okay, well, whatever, what if you're gay? Who cares? Well, people who are gay are also more suicidal and more depressed. So, there's many reasons why you should not want your kid to end up being suicidal and depressed because they're gay. I mean, that means you also should expose them to very healthy gender roles. But people don't want to connect those two. They just want to be like, oh, but I want to sound cool and say everything is accepted. But in the end, you're really not benefiting yourself. And for men, I would say really try to behave like a man. I mean, I cannot stress how often I see Muslim male creators behaving like women, pretending to be women. All these sketches about, oh, this is how women behave. This is how an Arab woman behaves. Like, I've seen it. Like, we get it. We get the point. We can Google Arab women ourselves if we want to. We don't have to see you do it. Or these creators who do their husband's makeup, or their husband does the makeup of the wife. It's like, there's no need to do that. We live in a situation where boys don't have role models. They're looking at social media to find their role models, and this is what you're presenting them with. we all have to take responsibility. And I think these are some of the things that need to go like immediately. That's what I would say. Okay, and then finally, well, not finally, almost finally, pray in the mosque like a real man. I think this issue that men have nowadays in the West of not having role models, not having a community of men, it also is very quickly solved if you just follow the commands of Allah. You know, go to the mosque. You're supposed to go to the mosque 5 times per day. If you read the hadith, by the way, about men having the praying congregation, like it's serious business. Like it's not just that men can stay at home, for example, to pray with their family. Like literally, even if you have your own family, you are supposed to go to the mosque to pray. And it just shows, you know, like the value that Allah tells us about of men being in a community of religious people. And just imagine also having to go to a mosque 5 times a day. It's very time consuming, which leaves you with not a lot of time to, I don't know, watch movies or play video games or even football. You know, football is another one of those things that's just like designed to distract men. It gives you a feeling of self-control in your life, but you have no control. You're literally watching a bunch of men kick a ball. Like that literally adds nothing to your life, but you're spending your time on that. Instead of that, you could have gone to the mosque. And so men who go to the mosque, I love it. And so I also think that when you go to the mosque, you know, you put in the effort, you put in the time to do that, the chances of you going home and then doing something completely against your religion, I think those are way lower because you're already in that mindset of doing the right thing. You're surrounded by people who do the right thing, who preach the right things. Anyways, my personal feelings when I know a man prays at the mosque, like I really respect that because I also feel like, what would keep you from following this command if you're a man? Like, I can imagine a command, you know, the reason why you wouldn't want to follow it, for example, in the Netherlands is because you're cold, you know, like you're cold, you don't want to leave the house. But like, how unmanly as a man, you cannot overcome the fact that you're cold. Like, just go, you know, or because you're tired, like, or because you just want to stay cozy inside, just go to the mosque, be a man. That's how I feel about this. And then the final one is men and women need to stop acting like the other one is the problem. I would say that I think there was a vicious circle we have where we blame the other. And so, for example, the women wouldn't want to marry a guy who's very feminine, but at the same time, a lot of women, they laugh at the jokes where men are emasculated. And so in Islam, we're not supposed to do that. Men and women are allies, right? And right now, it's completely been normalized for men to be emasculated and for that to be the joke of the day. And so much so that men started doing it themselves. Like men pretend to be women because they also understand, I guess, at this point that women find that entertaining. But in the end, when a woman ends up with a man who does that, I think they might think it's funny. They might be with someone who, you know, is famous because of that or has a lot of money because of that. But in the end, do you really respect a man who, you know, emasculates himself for money? It's giving prostitution to me. And the same goes for men. You know, a lot of men, they don't want to be with a woman who would sell her body online. Let's be honest. But a lot of men, they do idolize women who are half naked or, you know, who are behaving in ways that they wouldn't want their wives to behave like. But at the same time, you shouldn't be surprised that women in our community start doing that to themselves when they realize that this is what makes you receive the validation of a man. And so in the end, it's a vicious circle. Women start doing the things that they think men like, and men start doing the things they think women like. And that's putting a responsibility on all of us to also not encourage the other sex to do things that actually they shouldn't be doing because, one, it's not allowed in Islam. Second thing, it's disrupting our societies, you know. And one thing that I recently found out about, like in the Muslim world, I do think we have an issue of women explaining their bodies, but not through these platforms like OnlyFans. I don't think that's accepted here in this part of the world. But I recently found out that on TikTok Live, women actually go on live and then they just sit there and basically not say a lot. And then men send them gifts like stickers. I didn't know this, but they basically send stickers, and these stickers, they actually are money. And this is how, in this part of the world, we've created we've created a form of OnlyFans. And I guess like now it's done in this way, which is very informal, and it seems more innocent because the women sometimes are wearing hijab. Sometimes they're wearing niqab. They're wearing niqab and sitting there and getting sent money in these gifts. Like, what is happening? Anyways, and I think this is going to evolve eventually into having these platforms like OnlyFans. Might not be called OnlyFans, might be called differently, but it's setting us up in this part of the world as well for these types of things. I think it's very concerning. I think that's very concerning. Okay, anyways, I think that we have a lot of reason to focus on not pushing the agenda of weakening men. I think we have a lot of ideas as well. I hope after watching this, you also have more ideas about how you accidentally contributed to it. And I think for me, for example, one of the things I don't want to do is focus on women empowerment, because I feel like if we're living in a world where men are consciously being weakened, then I don't want to consciously empower women, because it's just making us more imbalanced. It's just creating more of a gap between men and women. And, you know, if you can see that men and women, you know, we are definitely complementary to each other. You know, we do function well. When the man solves problems, women can nurture in the household. When the man earns more and the mother, for example, can spend more time on her children, because that's already what's happening. But if that's not enough for you, another thing that I think a lot of people should take into account, that in the end, it will impact your children as well, whether you have these gender roles in place or not. I mean, I've talked about it with the LGBTQ+. They found out that it's influenced by, for a large part, right, by the environment. So whether the kid grows up with clear gender roles, but also children thrive when parents have a good relationship. That's also what research shows. The way a father supports a mother, that ends up impacting whether a child is going to be successful as an adult. And so people can be all like, oh, I want to do what I want to do, and oh, if a man is this, then whatever, you know, you do you, I do me. But in the end, I think we all agree that children should never be the victim of this. And sometimes the selfish behavior that adults display, it ends up impacting the child negatively. And so, I mean, this was all I wanted to say. You know, the only reason why I talk about this is because I would like for our community to be strong. I feel also very sad to know that men are being targeted like this. When you start noticing, okay? When you start paying attention to how much content is pushed where men pretend to be women or where men are emasculated, you can never ignore it again. And that's what I'm saying. Like, it's a religious agenda, because in Islam, we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to imitate the other gender. But then why is the algorithm designed in a way that this is super popular content online? And in a world where children already lack role models, don't you think it's problematic that kids are now being flooded with content where men are acting like women? Like, what do you think that does to their psyche? And what do you think it does to them being able to follow the rules of their religion? And that's why I think be very aware of it. Learn about all the commands that we have. They are good for you. Even when you don't realize it, they're good for you, you know? And we don't need to always look for the scientific evidence to support it. We can also just follow it, right? Without looking for the scientific evidence, even though I do share it, because sometimes I feel like people pretend to be, you know, smarter than the Quran, and then it always turns out that that's not the case. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Anyways, subscribe to my channel, and I look forward to seeing you again next week, inshallah.